"Run," the Duke's sister whispered. "He's already chosen you." But the doors were locked. The Ravenswood ball was, by universal agreement, the most coveted invitation of the season. It was also, in Cecilia Blackwood's private opinion, an exceptionally well-appointed cattle market. She stood in her customary position near the potted palms that lined the eastern wall of the ballroom, close enough to observe everything, while remaining functionally invisible to everyone. This was a skill she had cultivated over years of practice, the art of being present without being seen, of occupying space without claiming it. Her gown of dove-grey silk, while perfectly respectable, had been chosen specifically because it would draw no attention. Her honey-brown hair was pinned in a style that was neither fashionable nor unfashionable, simply adequate. Even her posture, shoulders slightly curved, chin neither raised nor lowered, projected an aura of pleasant insignificance. From this vantage point, she watched her younger sister Helena execute a perfect turn in the arms of Viscount Pemberton, her golden curls catching the candlelight, her laugh carrying across the room like music. Helena was everything Cecilia was not: beautiful, vivacious, the clear hope of the Blackwood family's increasingly precarious finances. At 19, Helena possessed the sort of effortless grace that made gentlemen compose terrible poetry and mammas clutch their fans in despair. Cecilia felt a familiar swell of pride as she watched her sister navigate the dance floor. She had spent 3 years preparing Helena for this debut, coaching her on conversation, advising her on dress, helping her practice the subtle art of appearing interested in gentlemen who talked endlessly about their horses. Helena's success would mean security for all of them. It was enough. It had to be enough. "You're doing it again," murmured a voice beside her. Cecilia turned to find Mrs. Arabella Thornton, a widow of comfortable means and her mother's oldest friend, settling into the space beside her with the practiced ease of a woman who had long ago stopped caring about her position in society. "Doing what?" "Watching from the shadows like a particularly well-dressed governess." Mrs. Thornton's eyes sparkled with amusement. "You know, my dear, you are permitted to dance. You are not yet so ancient as all that." "I am 24, Mrs. Thornton, practically decrepit by society's standards." "Nonsense. You are 24 and possessed of excellent sense, which is far more valuable than youth, though I grant you less marketable." She paused, her attention caught by something across the room. "Ah, the inspection has begun." Cecilia followed her gaze to the grand staircase, where a figure had appeared on the landing above the ballroom. Even from this distance, she could feel the shift in the room's attention, the subtle straightening of spines and adjustment of curls as the assembled young ladies registered his presence. Sebastian Ashworth, the Duke of Ravenswood. He stood motionless for a long moment, surveying the crowd below with the detached interest of a naturalist studying a collection of pinned butterflies. Tall and lean, dressed in severe black that made every other gentleman's evening wear look faintly ridiculous. He possessed the kind of face that was difficult to look away from, not because it was handsome, though it was, but because it seemed to contain no readable expression whatsoever. His dark hair was swept back from a pronounced widow's peak, and even at this distance Cecilia could see that his eyes were pale, grey perhaps, or some washed-out blue that gave him the appearance of seeing more than was comfortable. "The collector surveys his potential acquisitions," Mrs. Thornton said dryly. "Tell me, my dear, have you heard the current wager at White's?" "I try to avoid hearing anything about wagers at White's." "Very wise. But in this case the gentlemen are betting on whether His Grace will actually select a bride this season, or whether he will continue his streak of finding every eligible young lady in England somehow deficient." "Mrs. Thornton shook her head. 17 young women in 8 seasons, each one dismissed for reasons no one can quite fathom. Lady Margaret Ashby was too cheerful. Miss Pearson laughed too readily. The Worthington girl was deemed insufficiently curious. whatever that means. Cecilia watched as the Duke descended the staircase with measured steps, noting the way the crowd parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses, if Moses had been significantly less approachable and considerably better dressed. Perhaps he simply has exacting standards. Perhaps he has impossible ones. There are those who say his heart died with Miss Arabella Crane, and he is simply going through the motions expected of his station. Mrs. Thornton lowered her voice. Though between us, I always thought Miss Crane was rather too meek for comfort. The poor girl hardly said a word in company. Drowned in the lake on his estate, you know, just before the wedding. Terrible business. Cecilia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draught from the tall windows. I had heard something of it. Well, it was a long time ago, and grief does strange things to people. Still, one cannot help but pity whatever young woman he eventually does select. Imagine being chosen by a man who examines potential brides the way one examines horseflesh at Tattersall's. The Duke had reached the ballroom floor now, and was moving through the crowd with the inevitable gravity of a ship passing through smaller vessels. Cecilia watched as he paused before a group of young ladies, exchanged what appeared to be precisely 3 sentences with their chaperones, and moved on. The young ladies' faces fell in his wake, hope extinguished as efficiently as a snuffed candle. "I rather think I would prefer not to be chosen at all," Cecilia said quietly. "Being invisible has its advantages." Mrs. Thornton gave her a long, considering look. "Does it, my dear? Does it really?" Before Cecilia could respond, a commotion near the dance floor drew her attention. Helena had stumbled during a turn, her ankle twisting beneath her, and she was now clinging to Viscount Pemberton's arm with her expression of barely concealed pain. "Excuse me," Cecilia said, already moving through the crowd with the efficiency of long practice. She reached Helena's side in moments, smoothly inserting herself between her sister and the curious onlookers. "It's nothing," Helena whispered through gritted teeth. "I simply lost my footing. You've twisted your ankle." Cecilia's voice was calm, practical. "Lord Pemberton, if you would be so kind as to help my sister to that chair, I will locate our mother and arrange for some ice." The Viscount complied with evident relief, clearly grateful to have someone take charge. Cecilia guided her sister through the crowd, selecting a path that would minimize attention while moving toward the retiring room set aside for ladies' emergencies. "I've ruined everything," Helena murmured, her face flushed with embarrassment. "The Duke was about to ask me to dance. I saw him looking—" "The Duke was about to examine you like a prize heifer," Cecilia corrected quietly. "You have been spared, not ruined. Now lean on me and try not to put weight on that foot." They had nearly reached the retiring room when a figure stepped into their path, tall, dark, and radiating the kind of authority that made ordinary mortals instinctively step aside. "Miss Blackwood, I presume?" The voice was low and measured, betraying nothing. "I observed your sister's mishap. May I be of assistance?" Cecilia looked up and up further still into eyes that were indeed grey, the colour of winter storms over the North Sea. This close, the Duke of Ravenswood was even more unsettling than he had appeared from across the room. There was an intensity to his gaze that felt almost physical, as if he were cataloguing every detail of her appearance and filing it away for future reference. She realized with a start that he was looking at her, not through her, not past her to her beautiful sister at her. "That is very kind of you, Your Grace," she said, finding her voice. "But I believe I have the situation well in hand. My sister merely requires a few moments' rest, and perhaps some cold compresses." "Indeed." His gaze did not waver. "And you are the elder Miss Blackwood, I take it? The one who has been standing by the potted palms for the past 2 hours, watching the proceedings with what I can only describe as sardonic amusement?" Cecilia felt heat rise to her cheeks. He had noticed her. Despite her careful cultivation of invisibility, despite her grey dress and unremarkable position, He had seen her watching, and he had apparently been watching back. "I was not aware my amusement was visible at such a distance, Your Grace. It was in the set of your shoulders, and the slight curl at the corner of your mouth whenever a particularly eager mamma steered her daughter into my path." His own lips twitched, so slightly she might have imagined it. "Tell me, Miss Blackwood, what is it about my ball that you find so entertaining?" She should demur. She should apologize for any appearance of mockery, reassure him that his hospitality was above reproach, and extract herself from this conversation with all possible speed. That was what a sensible woman would do. But Cecilia had spent a lifetime being sensible, and something about this man's penetrating gaze made her suddenly, recklessly tired of it. "Truthfully, Your Grace, I find it rather an elegant cattle market. The young ladies are paraded about for inspection, their qualities assessed and found wanting according to criteria no one quite understands, and the entire assembly holds its breath to see which specimen you will deem worthy of purchase this season." She smiled sweetly. "It is vastly entertaining, if one is not among the livestock." Beside her, Helena made a small sound of horror. Somewhere in the distance, Cecilia could swear she heard Mrs. Thornton choking on her champagne. The Duke's expression did not change, but something shifted in those grey eyes, a spark of what might have been surprise, or perhaps interest, or possibly murderous intent. It was difficult to tell with a face that guarded. "And you believe yourself exempt from such assessment?" "I believe myself invisible to it, Your Grace. There is a difference." She tightened her grip on Helena's arm. "Now, if you will excuse us, my sister requires attention." She did not wait for his permission, a breach of etiquette that would surely give her mother palpitations, but guided Helena past him toward the retiring room, feeling his gaze on her back like the pressure of a hand. "Cecilia," Helena hissed as soon as they were out of earshot, "did you just call the Duke of Ravenswood's ball a cattle market? To his face?" "I believe I did, yes. Mother is going to murder you." "Mother would have to notice me first." Cecilia settled Helena onto a chaise in the retiring room and began examining her ankle with practiced hands. "The swelling is minimal. You'll be able to dance again within the hour if we apply cold compresses now." "I don't care about dancing. I care about the fact that you just insulted the most eligible bachelor in England and probably destroyed any chance of... Any chance of what? He was never going to choose you, Helena." Cecilia's voice was gentle but firm. "He never chooses anyone. That is rather the point. And even if he did, would you truly want to be chosen by a man who approaches matrimony like an auction at Christie's?" Helena was quiet for a moment, her lovely face troubled. "No," she admitted finally. "No, I don't suppose I would. But Mother wants you to make a good match. A duke is not necessarily a good match if the duke in question treats his wife like an acquisition to be displayed on a shelf." Cecilia smoothed her sister's hair back from her face. "Rest here. I'll find some ice and locate Mother to tell her you've had a minor mishap, but will recover shortly." She slipped out of the retiring room and made her way toward the servants' corridor, where she might find someone to help with compresses. The hallway was quieter here, away from the noise and heat of the ballroom, and she allowed herself a moment to lean against the wall and close her eyes. What had she been thinking? Calling the Duke's ball a cattle market to his face like some sort of unhinged social revolutionary. Her mother would be apoplectic, society would whisper, and the Duke himself would probably have them thrown out of his house before the night was over. "You look as though you're contemplating your own execution." Cecilia's eyes flew open. A young woman stood at the end of the corridor, watching her with an expression of tentative curiosity. She was perhaps 19, with the same dark hair and pale eyes as the Duke, though her features were softer, her bearing less forbidding. She wore a gown of ice-blue silk that matched her eyes perfectly, but her hands were twisting nervously in the fabric. Lady Philippa, Cecilia said, recognition dawning. The Duke's younger sister, rarely seen in society, rumoured to be of delicate constitution. I apologize, I did not mean to intrude. You're not intruding. I'm hiding. Lady Philippa's smile was rueful. I find large gatherings rather overwhelming. The noise, the crowds, the constant necessity of making conversation with people who only want to talk to me because of who my brother is. She moved closer, her movements quick and bird-like. You're Miss Blackwood, aren't you? The one who told Sebastian his ball was a cattle market? Cecilia felt her face flame. Word travels fast. Sound travels through these walls better than you might think. I was in the gallery above the ballroom. Lady Philippa's eyes sparkled with something that looked remarkably like delight. I thought he was going to swallow his tongue. No one has spoken to him like that in years, possibly ever. I suspect I shall be asked to leave shortly. I suspect you shall not. My brother despises sycophants above all things. You may be the first honest person he's encountered in a decade. Lady Philippa's expression grew more serious, the animation fading from her face, though that may not be entirely to your advantage. Something in her tone made Cecilia's skin prickle with unease. I'm not sure I understand. My brother is not a cruel man, Miss Blackwood. Whatever you may have heard about him, whatever society may whisper, he is not cruel. She paused, her pale eyes suddenly intent. But he is relentless. Once he decides something, nothing sways him. Nothing. He will pursue his objective with single-minded determination until he achieves it, regardless of obstacles, regardless of objections, regardless of... She stopped abruptly, as if realizing she had said too much. Regardless of what, Lady Philippa? The younger woman shook her head, the nervous energy returning to her movements. I should return to the ball. Mother's portrait is being displayed in the gallery, and I promised to speak to Lady Ashworth about the restoration work. She started to move past Cecilia, then stopped, her hand reaching out to touch Cecilia's arm. Her fingers were cold and trembling slightly. Be careful, Miss Blackwood. My brother sees things others miss, and when he finds something he wants... She trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, and hurried away down the corridor before Cecilia could respond. Cecilia stood alone in the quiet hallway, her heart beating faster than it should. What a strange family, she thought. A duke who conducted annual inspections of potential brides and never selected anyone, and a sister who spoke in cryptic warnings about relentlessness and single-minded pursuit. She shook off the unease and continued toward the servants' quarters. Ice for Helena's ankle. That was what mattered now. Everything else was merely the peculiar atmosphere of an unfamiliar house and a strange encounter with its even stranger owner. By the time she returned to the retiring room with compresses, Helena's ankle had improved significantly, and their mother had appeared in a flurry of lavender silk and barely concealed agitation. There you are, Cecilia. What is this I hear about you speaking to the Duke of Ravenswood? I merely exchanged a few words with His Grace when he inquired after Helena's injury, Mamma. A few words. Her mother's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Thornton said you called his ball a cattle market. Mrs. Thornton has excellent hearing. Cecilia Blackwood, this is not a joking matter. Do you have any idea how important this evening is? Helena's future, our family's future, depends on her making an excellent match this season. We cannot afford to offend someone of the Duke's consequence. I hardly think the Duke's consequence will be affected by the opinions of an invisible spinster, Mamma. And Helena's ankle is much improved. She should be able to return to the ballroom within the hour. Her mother's expression softened slightly as she looked at Helena, whose colour had returned to normal. Well, that is something at least. Though the Viscount has already danced with you once, Helena, so we shall have to find other partners. Lord Ashworth was showing interest before your mishap. Cecilia tuned out the familiar cataloguing of potential suitors, her mind wandering back to the Duke's grey eyes and the strange intensity of his regard. He had noticed her watching. He had looked at her, truly looked in a way that no one ever had. It was unsettling. And yet, some treacherous part of her had felt a spark of something like recognition in that moment, as if he had seen past her careful camouflage to something underneath. Ridiculous. She was invisible. That was the entire point. The rest of the evening passed in the usual fashion. Helena returned to the ballroom and danced several more times, her ankle apparently recovered. Cecilia resumed her position near the potted palms, though she found herself unable to relax into her customary invisibility. Every time she looked up, she half expected to find those grey eyes watching her from across the room. But the Duke seemed to have forgotten her existence entirely. She saw him dancing once with the Thornton girl, exchanging words with several matriarchs, and spending a long time examining a painting in the corner of the room with an elderly gentleman who was apparently some sort of art expert. He did not look in her direction again. By midnight, the ball was winding down. Carriages were being called, and guests were beginning to make their farewells. Cecilia was helping Helena arrange her wrap when a footman appeared at her elbow, his face expressionless. "Miss Blackwood, His Grace requests that your family attend him in the blue study before departing." Cecilia felt her stomach drop. So she was to be reprimanded for her impertinence after all, perhaps even asked to apologize publicly. She squared her shoulders and followed the footman, her mother and sister trailing behind with expressions of mingled confusion and alarm. The blue study was smaller than she had expected, intimate rather than imposing, lined with books that looked as though they had actually been read rather than merely displayed. A fire burned low in the grate, and heavy curtains were drawn against the windows, giving the room a sense of enclosed warmth that was at odds with its owner's reputation for coldness. The Duke stood before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. He did not turn as they entered, but she could see his reflection in the mirror above the mantel, those pale eyes watching them approach with unreadable intensity. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, finally turning to face them, "thank you for attending me." "Your Grace." Her mother's voice was bright with nervous courtesy. "We are honored by the invitation, though I confess myself uncertain as to its purpose. If this is regarding my elder daughter's earlier remarks, I assure you she meant no. I wish to court your daughter." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread outward in all directions. Cecilia watched her mother's face transform from anxiety to confusion to dawning hope, while Helena's expression shifted through a more complex series of emotions that Cecilia could not quite read. "Your Grace," her mother breathed. We are Helena would be, not Helena." The Duke's gaze moved past her mother, past her beautiful sister, and settled on Cecilia with that same unnerving intensity she had felt earlier. "Cecilia." For a moment, no one spoke. Cecilia was distantly aware that she should say something, should express surprise or gratitude or confusion, but words seemed to have abandoned her entirely. She could only stare at the Duke as the impossible nature of his declaration sank in. He wanted to court her, not Helena, with her golden curls and perfect manners and marriageable beauty. Her, the invisible sister. The spinster in training. The woman who had called his ball a cattle market to his face not 3 hours ago. "I don't understand," she heard herself say, her voice sounding strange and distant in her own ears. "It is quite simple, Miss Blackwood. I find you interesting. That is a rare enough quality to warrant further investigation." His expression betrayed nothing, but there was something in his voice, a hint of something that might have been wry humour, that made her skin prickle with awareness. "I am proposing a courtship, not a contract. Merely the opportunity to become better acquainted under appropriate circumstances." "But—" Cecilia's mind was spinning. "We exchanged perhaps 20 words this evening, Your Grace, and most of them were insulting." "Precisely. I am 24. I have no fortune, No particular accomplishments? No. Miss Blackwood. He cut her off, his voice sharpening slightly. I have spent 8 seasons being presented with young ladies who simper and agree and say nothing of substance whatsoever. You called my ball a cattle market and suggested I examine potential brides like horseflesh. It was refreshing, alarming, but refreshing. Her mother had recovered enough to speak again, though her voice was strangled with the effort of containing her emotions. Your Grace, we are deeply honored by your interest. My daughter would be, that is to say, we would be delighted to accept your courtship. Mamma, Cecilia started. Cecilia. Her mother's tone brooked no argument. We will discuss this later, in private. Cecilia felt the walls closing in around her. She wanted to protest, to demand time to think, to understand what was happening. But her mother's face was set in lines of immovable determination, and the Duke was watching her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see straight through to her bones. Very well, she heard herself say. I accept your courtship, Your Grace. The words felt like a surrender. The Duke inclined his head, a small gesture of acknowledgement that somehow conveyed more satisfaction than any smile could have. Excellent. I shall call upon you tomorrow to discuss the particulars. The next few minutes passed in a blur of courtesies and farewells. Cecilia moved through them mechanically, responding when required, aware only of a growing sense of unreality that made everything feel distant and dreamlike. This was not possible. Dukes did not choose invisible spinsters. There had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding, some explanation that made sense. She was still turning it over in her mind when she found herself near the entrance hall, separated momentarily from her mother and sister by a knot of departing guests. The great doors stood open ahead of her, revealing carriages and torchlight, and the promise of escape into the cold February night. A hand closed around her arm, small, cold, trembling. Miss Blackwood. Lady Philippa stood beside her, her face pale in the flickering candlelight, her eyes wide with something that looked terribly like fear. I have to go, Cecilia said. My mother is waiting. Run. The word was barely a whisper, urgent and breathless. He's already chosen you. Cecilia's heart stuttered in her chest. What do you mean? I mean he decided the moment you spoke to him. I saw his face when you called his ball a cattle market. I know that expression. Once he decides something. Philippa's grip tightened on her arm. You have to leave. Now. Before. A sound cut through the hall, the heavy metallic click of locks engaging. Cecilia turned toward the great doors just in time to see them swing closed, footmen taking up positions before them with the immovable solidity of palace guards. What? A butler appeared, his face professionally apologetic. Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that an ice storm has descended upon the area with unexpected severity. His Grace has ordered that all guests remain at Ravenswood Manor for the night, for their own safety. Rooms are being prepared as we speak. A murmur ran through the crowd. Surprise, inconvenience, a few excited whispers about the novelty of being trapped at the Duke's estate. But Cecilia barely heard any of it. She was staring at the locked doors, at the footmen who stood before them like sentinels, at the windows that showed only darkness and the glitter of ice on glass. She was trapped. Miss Blackwood. Lady Philippa's voice was barely audible now, her face drawn with something that might have been guilt or fear or both. I'm so sorry. I tried to warn you. Lady Philippa. The Duke's voice cut across the hall, calm and commanding. Please escort our guests to the gallery while rooms are prepared. Mrs. Blackwood, Miss Helena, Miss Cecilia, you will have the honor of staying in the East Wing. I shall ensure your comfort is attended to. He was descending the staircase as he spoke, his dark figure commanding attention with the ease of long practice. But his eyes were fixed on Cecilia, and she could not shake the feeling that everything else, the storm, the locked doors, the convenient necessity of overnight accommodation, had been arranged specifically to prevent her escape. Ridiculous. No one could control the weather. No one could have known she would be here, would insult him, would catch his attention in a way that apparently no one else had managed in 8 seasons. And yet, as she followed the footman toward the east wing with her mother and sister, she found herself looking back over her shoulder to the gallery above the entrance hall. The Duke stood there, watching her departure with those pale grey eyes, his face utterly unreadable. "He's relentless," Philippa had said. "Once he decides something, nothing sways him." The doors were locked. The storm raged outside, and somewhere above her, a man who approached matrimony like a collector selecting acquisitions had apparently decided that Cecilia Blackwood was something he wanted to acquire. She had spent her entire life cultivating invisibility, and now, in a single evening, she had been seen truly, terrifyingly seen, by possibly the one person in England capable of making her wish she had remained hidden forever. Her room in the East Wing was beautiful, all pale blue silk and mahogany furniture, a fire already crackling in the grate, fresh flowers on the dressing table despite it being February. A nightgown had been laid out for her, clearly from Lady Philippa's wardrobe, along with everything she might need for an unexpected overnight stay. Cecilia stood at the window, staring out at the darkness beyond the glass. Ice coated every surface, making the gardens below look like something from a fairy tale, beautiful and frozen and utterly impassable. The storm was real, at least. No one could have manufactured this crystalline prison. But the timing, the convenience of it, the way the Duke had looked at her when the locks clicked home, as if everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and tried to calm her racing heart. Tomorrow, she would find answers. Tomorrow, she would demand to know what the Duke wanted from her, why he had chosen her of all people, what his sister's cryptic warnings truly meant. Tonight, she would not sleep. Behind her, the fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows across the walls of her beautiful prison. Somewhere in the house, footsteps echoed, measured, deliberate, unhurried. The Duke of Ravenswood was taking his time. He had already chosen her after all, and now, with the doors locked and the ice sealing every exit, he had all the time in the world. Cecilia did not sleep. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, surrounded by silk and down and the lingering scent of lavender, staring at the canopy above her head as the hours crawled past. Every creak of the house made her heart lurch. Every footstep in the corridor sent her bolt upright, certain that the door was about to open and reveal what? A kidnapper? An abductor? A duke with pale grey eyes and inexplicable intentions? Nothing came. The house settled into silence around her, broken only by the occasional groan of ice-laden branches against the windows. When grey light finally began to seep around the edges of the curtains, Cecilia abandoned any pretense of rest and rose to examine her prison. The room was even more beautiful in daylight than it had been by candlelight. Delicate watercolours adorned the walls, depicting pastoral scenes that seemed designed to soothe troubled minds. The furniture was elegant without being ostentatious, the kind of quality that spoke of generations of wealth rather than newly acquired fortune. Even the view from the window, now that she could see it clearly, was spectacular. A formal garden transformed by ice into a glittering wonderland, with a frozen fountain at its center and an avenue of crystalline trees leading toward a lake she could just glimpse in the distance. A prison, yes, but a very beautiful one. A knock at the door made her spin around, her heart hammering. "Miss Blackwood?" A maid's voice, cheerful and unconcerned. "I've brought hot water for washing, miss, and Lady Philippa has sent some of her gowns for you to choose from. She said to tell you that breakfast will be served in the morning room at 9, and His Grace hopes you will join him. His Grace hopes. Not requests, not commands. Hopes. As if the Duke of Ravenswood was capable of anything so mild as hope. Cecilia opened the door to admit a young woman with rosy cheeks and an armful of fabric. The maid bustled about the room with efficient cheerfulness, laying out an array of morning gowns in various shades of blue and green, preparing the washstand, chattering about the storm and how no one had seen ice like this in 20 years, and wasn't it lucky that His Grace had such a well-stocked house? "Is there any word on when the roads might be passable?" Cecilia asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Oh, not for days, miss. The ice is inches thick, and more falling all the time. Even the stables are closed up tight. His Grace sent word to all the families in the village to stay inside and keep their fires burning." The maid smiled brightly. "But there's nothing to worry about here, miss. Ravenswood Manor could hold 100 guests comfortable like, and we've barely got 30. 30 guests. Cecilia felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. She was not alone here, trapped in some Gothic nightmare with only a sinister duke for company. There were other families, other young ladies, other potential brides for the duke to examine and dismiss. Perhaps his choice of her had been a momentary whim, already forgotten in the cold light of morning. She chose the simplest of the gowns, a deep forest green that Lady Philippa would probably never miss, and allowed the maid to help her dress and arrange her hair. The face that looked back at her from the mirror was pale and tired, with shadows under her eyes that no amount of cold water could entirely banish. But she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. She had faced down a duke while calling his ball a cattle market. She could certainly face him again over breakfast. The morning room was bright and warm, filled with the kind of golden winter light that made everything look like a painting. Several guests were already seated at a long table laden with enough food to feed an army, eggs and ham and toast and kippers and at least 4 kinds of jam. Her mother was there, resplendent in borrowed finery, holding court with Mrs. Thornton and 2 other matrons whose names Cecilia could not immediately recall. Helena sat beside her, looking tired but lovely, pushing food around her plate with unusual disinterest. The Duke was nowhere to be seen. Cecilia felt a wash of relief so strong it nearly made her knees buckle. She filled a plate with food she did not want and found a seat at the far end of the table, as far from her mother as possible. "You look dreadful." She looked up to find Lady Philippa sliding into the chair beside her, her own plate holding nothing but a single piece of dry toast. The Duke's sister looked even more anxious than she had the night before, her pale eyes darting around the room as if searching for threats. "I didn't sleep," Cecilia admitted. "Your warning rather kept me awake." Philippa's face flushed with what might have been shame. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have, that is. I didn't mean to frighten you. Sebastian isn't dangerous, whatever you might think. He's just—" She trailed off, her fingers tearing the toast into smaller and smaller pieces. "Relentless?" Cecilia supplied. "Yes, that." Philippa took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "I should explain. About last night. About what I said." "I wish you would." "It's only that Sebastian has been looking for something for a very long time. Ever since Arabella died. He examines every young woman who crosses his path, looking for some quality he can never quite articulate. And every time, he finds them wanting. Too meek, too loud, too agreeable, too contrary, too something, or not enough of something else." Philippa's voice dropped. "I've watched him for 8 years, Miss Blackwood. I've seen his face when he meets each new candidate, and last night, when he looked at you, it was different. He looked like a man who had finally found what he was searching for." "Which is what, exactly? A woman foolish enough to insult him to his face? A woman brave enough to be honest with him?" Philippa's eyes met hers, intense and earnest. "You must understand. Sebastian blames himself for Arabella's death. She was sweet and gentle and everything society says a wife should be. She never disagreed with him. She never told him when something frightened her. And when he suggested a boating party on the lake, she never mentioned that she couldn't swim. She simply got into the boat because he wanted her to, and when the wind came up and the boat capsized, she swallowed hard. He pulled her out. He tried to save her. But it was too late. Cecilia felt something in her chest shift, not quite sympathy, but something close to it. That's horrible. It was. It is. He's never forgiven himself for not seeing it, for not realizing that her compliance was a mask for terror. He spent 8 years searching for a woman who would tell him no, who would argue with him, who would have the courage to say, "I can't swim, and I don't want to get in that boat." Philippa's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile. "You called his ball a cattle market, Miss Blackwood, in front of everyone, to his face. It was the most honest thing anyone has said to him in a decade. So I am to be courted because I was rude? You are to be courted because you were truthful. There is a difference." Philippa pushed her plate away, the toast reduced to crumbs. "I'm not asking you to accept him. I'm only asking you to understand. He's not choosing you because he wants to possess you. He's choosing you because he believes you're the one person who won't let him make another terrible mistake." Before Cecilia could respond, the morning room doors opened and the Duke entered. Conversation faltered momentarily as every eye turned toward him, then resumed with studied casualness as guests pretended they had not been watching. He crossed the room with that measured stride Cecilia was beginning to recognize as characteristic, acknowledging various guests with small nods, but not stopping until he reached the far end of the table, the far end where Cecilia sat. "Miss Blackwood, Lady Philippa." He settled into the chair across from them, as if it had been reserved specifically for his use, which, Cecilia realized, it probably had. "I trust you slept well?" "Tolerably, Your Grace." Philippa's voice was barely above a whisper. "Not at all, Your Grace." Cecilia met his gaze directly. "I found myself rather unsettled by the events of last evening. Being chosen unexpectedly by a duke tends to disrupt one's rest." His lips twitched. It was such a small movement that she might have imagined it, but she was almost certain she saw a flicker of amusement in those grey eyes. "I imagine it does. Perhaps you would allow me to make amends. I thought you might enjoy a tour of the house while we are all confined here. The library in particular contains some volumes that might interest a woman of your obvious intelligence." "My obvious intelligence?" Cecilia raised an eyebrow. "We have exchanged perhaps 30 words, Your Grace." "I was not aware intelligence could be so quickly assessed." "It shows in the eyes, Miss Blackwood, and in the set of the shoulders when one is observing foolishness." He rose, extending a hand toward her. "Come, let me show you my collection." It was not a request. Cecilia recognized that much. But neither was it quite a command, more an assumption of acquiescence, as if he could not imagine she would refuse. Every instinct screamed at her to do exactly that, to refuse, to remain safely in this crowded room, to avoid being alone with a man whose intensity frightened her more than she wanted to admit. But another part of her, the part that had spent 24 years being invisible, being overlooked, being told in 1,000 subtle ways that she was not worth noticing, that part wanted to know why. Why had he chosen her? What did he see when he looked at her? What was he searching for that he believed only she could provide? She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and surprisingly gentle. She felt a jolt of something awareness, perhaps, or alarm run through her like electricity. "Excellent," he said quietly. "Follow me." The library of Ravenswood Manor was nothing short of spectacular. 2 stories tall, with a gallery running around the upper level and a domed ceiling painted with clouds and angels, It contained more books than Cecilia had seen in her entire life. Floor-to-ceiling shelves covered every wall, broken only by tall windows that let in the grey winter light, and a massive fireplace where flames crackled and danced. "Oh," Cecilia breathed, stopping just inside the doorway to take in the scale of it. "Oh my. You approve?" There was something in his voice that might have been satisfaction. "I have never seen so many books in one place. It's extraordinary." She moved forward almost involuntarily, drawn toward the nearest shelf as if magnetized. "How many volumes do you have?" "Approximately 40,000 at last count, though I continue to acquire more whenever something interesting comes to my attention." He moved to stand beside her, not quite touching but close enough that she was acutely aware of his presence. "My great-grandfather began the collection. My grandfather expanded it considerably. My father had little interest in books, he preferred horses and hunting, but I have continued the tradition." Cecilia ran her fingers along the spines of the books nearest to her, reading titles in Latin and Greek and French and English. Philosophy, history, natural science, poetry, novels. The collection seemed to contain everything ever written by anyone who had ever put pen to paper. "You may borrow anything you like during your stay," the Duke said. "In fact, I insist upon it. I cannot imagine anything more tedious than being trapped in a house with nothing to read. You would let me touch these?" She turned to stare at him. "Some of these must be irreplaceable." "They are. But books are meant to be read, Miss Blackwood, not merely displayed behind glass. What would be the point of owning them otherwise?" He moved past her toward a section of shelves near the fireplace. "May I ask what you prefer to read? Poetry? Novels? Something more substantive?" "Everything." The word came out before she could stop it. "History, philosophy, natural science, novels, yes, though I am told they are unsuitable for ladies of quality. Anything that tells me something I did not know before. And yet you have been content to stand by potted palms observing cattle markets?" There was that flicker of amusement again, barely visible but definitely present. "It seems a waste of a curious mind." "Curious minds are not highly valued in ladies, Your Grace. We are meant to be accomplished in music and needlework and the management of households, not in philosophy and science." "And you have accepted this?" "I have had no choice but to accept it. My family's circumstances do not permit rebellion." She pulled a volume from the shelf at random, a collection of essays on natural philosophy, and pretended to examine it while avoiding his gaze. "We do what we must to survive, Your Grace. Even those of us with curious minds." He was silent for a moment. When she dared to look up, she found him watching her with an expression she could not read. "You speak of survival," he said finally, "and yet you insulted me to my face within moments of our first meeting. That seems a rather dangerous form of survival. I did not know who you were. Would you have spoken differently if you had?" Cecilia considered the question. Would she have? Would she have smiled and simpered and agreed that his ball was perfectly lovely, that his selection process was entirely reasonable, that she was honored beyond words by his attention? "No," she admitted. "Probably not. I have never been very good at dissembling." "No." His voice had softened slightly. "I noticed." He moved closer, and she found herself backing up until her shoulders touched the bookshelves behind her. He stopped just short of trapping her, leaving enough space that she could escape if she chose to, but close enough that she could see the grey of his eyes, the slight lines at their corners, the shadow of stubble along his jaw that suggested he had not taken as much care with his toilet as usual. "May I tell you something, Miss Blackwood? Something I have never told anyone?" Her heart was beating very fast now. "If you wish." "I do not believe in love." He said it simply, as if stating a mathematical fact. "I watched it destroy my parents. My mother loved my father desperately, and he barely noticed her existence. I watched it kill Arabella. She loved me so blindly that she walked into a boat rather than disappoint me. Love makes fools of us all. It blinds us. It renders us incapable of rational decision-making. Then why are you courting me? Cecilia heard herself ask. If you do not believe in love, what is the point of marriage? Partnership. The word came out flat, certain. Companionship. An alliance between two people who see each other clearly, without the distortion of romantic sentiment. Someone to stand beside me and tell me when I am wrong. Someone who will not follow me into a boat simply because I ask. That sounds rather cold, Your Grace. Does it? He tilted his head, studying her. Or does it sound honest? You spoke of survival, Miss Blackwood, of doing what we must. I am offering you an opportunity to do more than survive, to live, to have access to libraries like this one, to speak your mind without consequence, to be seen and valued for exactly who you are rather than who society expects you to be. And in return? In return, I ask only for honesty, for courage, for the willingness to disagree with me when I am wrong. His voice dropped lower. I have spent 8 years searching for someone who would tell me no, someone who would not drown rather than disappoint me. When you called my ball a cattle market, Miss Blackwood, you were the first person in a decade to tell me an uncomfortable truth. I cannot tell you how refreshing that was. Cecilia's mind was spinning. This was not what she had expected. She had braced herself for arrogance, for cold calculation, for the imperious demands of a man accustomed to getting everything he wanted. Instead, she found herself facing something far more complicated, a man haunted by tragedy, seeking not love but partnership, offering not romance but a kind of brutal honesty she had never encountered. You barely know me, she said weakly. I know that you are intelligent, that you are observant, that you are honest to the point of recklessness. His lips curved slightly. I know that you have spent years making yourself invisible, watching from the shadows while your beautiful sister commanded attention. I know that you believe yourself unworthy of notice, and I know that you are wrong. How can you possibly know all that? Because I recognize it. His voice was barely a whisper now. I have spent my life watching from a distance, calculating outcomes, refusing to feel because feeling led to catastrophe. You and I are alike, Miss Blackwood. We are both hiding. The only difference is that I have decided to stop. The space between them had somehow shrunk to nearly nothing. Cecilia could feel the warmth of his body, could see the rise and fall of his chest beneath his perfectly tailored coat. His eyes held hers, grey and intense and searching, and she found herself unable to look away. Give me a chance, he said quietly. 3 days. We are trapped here until the ice melts regardless. Let me show you who I am. Let me prove that I am not the cold, calculating monster society believes me to be. And at the end of those 3 days, if you still wish to refuse me, I will release you from the courtship with no ill will. And if I don't wish to refuse you? Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or hope, or something she could not quite name. Then we will discuss next steps when the time comes. It was a reasonable offer, more than reasonable. He was giving her power in a situation where she had none, offering her a choice when society would have insisted she had already made one. Very well, Cecilia heard herself say. 3 days. The first day passed more quickly than Cecilia expected. The Duke Sebastian, as she was beginning to think of him, though she would not dare use the name aloud, proved to be an unexpectedly engaging companion. He did not hover or overwhelm her with attention, but he appeared regularly throughout the day, drawing her into conversations that ranged from the philosophical to the absurd. They debated the merits of Wordsworth versus Byron over luncheon, while her mother watched with barely concealed triumph. They argued about the proper classification of insects while examining specimens in his study. They discussed the future of parliamentary reform while other guests played cards in the drawing room. He was brilliant. That much was undeniable. His mind moved quickly, making connections she had not considered, challenging her assumptions in ways that were invigorating rather than dismissive. He listened when she spoke, really listened, with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable, and he remembered everything she said. But there was something else beneath the intellect. Moments when his guard slipped and she glimpsed something raw and wounded underneath. When he spoke of his mother, dead when he was 12. When he described the loneliness of inheriting a dukedom at 20. When he mentioned briefly and without elaboration the weight of expectations he had carried all his life. "You make it sound as though being a duke is a burden rather than a privilege," she observed late in the afternoon, as they stood together in the conservatory watching the grey light fade. "It is both." He was examining a delicate orchid with more attention than the flower seemed to warrant. "Privilege without choice is merely another form of prison. I was born to this role. I did not choose it. Every aspect of my life has been determined by an accident of birth where I live, how I spend my time, whom I may associate with, whom I may marry. And yet you have rejected 17 potential brides. That suggests some degree of choice." "Some." His voice was bitter. "Within very narrow parameters. I must marry someone of appropriate birth and fortune. I must produce heirs. I must maintain the estate and honor the family name. The only choice I have is which appropriate young lady I chain myself to for the rest of my existence." "Is that how you see marriage? As chains?" He turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. "I used to, before last night." "What changed?" "I met a woman who called my ball a cattle market, and looked at me as if I were merely a man instead of a title." His voice dropped. "You have no idea how long I have waited for someone to see me, Miss Blackwood. The real me. Not the Duke, not the collector. Just Sebastian." Cecilia felt something shift in her chest, some wall she had carefully constructed beginning to crack. This was dangerous. She had agreed to 3 days, to evaluating a potential partnership, not to this, whatever this was. This strange, terrifying intimacy that was developing between them despite all her attempts to maintain distance. "I should return to my family," she said, taking a step back. "My mother will be wondering where I am." "Of course." He did not try to stop her, though something flickered in his eyes that might have been disappointment. "I shall see you at dinner, Miss Blackwood." She fled. There was no other word for it. She fled the conservatory and the Duke and the confusing tangle of emotions he was stirring up inside her, retreating to her borrowed room to press her hands against her heated cheeks and wonder what was happening to her carefully ordered life. The second day brought new revelations. Cecilia discovered Sebastian early in the morning, alone in a small sitting room off the main gallery, tending to a wounded bird he had apparently found the night before. The creature was small and brown and clearly terrified, huddled in a handkerchief-lined box near the fire, but Sebastian's hands were gentle as he offered it water from a tiny dish. "I didn't take you for a man who rescues injured sparrows," she said from the doorway. He didn't look up. Most injured things can be healed, if one has patience. The trick is not to frighten them further while attempting to help. Is that philosophy or ornithology? Both, perhaps. He finally raised his eyes to hers, and there was a vulnerability in his expression that she had not seen before. "I found her in the courtyard last night, half frozen. One of her wings is damaged, but not beyond repair. In a few days, she should be able to fly again." Cecilia moved closer, drawn by the unexpected tenderness of the scene. The Duke of Ravenswood, terror of the marriage mart, spoon-feeding water to a sparrow. It did not fit any of the narratives she had constructed about him. "You're not what I expected," she heard herself say. "No?" His lips curved slightly. "What did you expect?" "Cold, calculating, interested only in acquisition." She sat down across from him, watching his gentle hands tend to the bird. "The collector, they call you, as if women were objects to be displayed on shelves." "That name was not my invention." His voice was quiet. "It was given to me by society after I rejected my first potential bride, Lady Margaret Ashby. She was everything a duchess should be: beautiful, accomplished, gracious, and utterly, completely terrified of me." "Terrified?" I saw it in her eyes. The way she flinched whenever I spoke directly to her, the way she agreed with everything I said, not because she believed it, but because she was afraid to contradict me. He set down the water dish and looked at Cecilia directly. I thought of Arabella, of how she had agreed with everything too, right up until the moment the boat capsized, and I knew I could not do that to another woman. "So you rejected her?" "I released her. There is a difference. I told her father that we were not suited, that she deserved someone who would make her happy rather than afraid. He was furious, of course. The gossip was brutal. But she married a country vicar 6 months later and has been blissfully happy ever since." His smile was bitter. "I receive a Christmas card from her every year. She has 4 children now. She thanks me for setting her free." Cecilia was quiet for a moment, processing this new information. All those rejected brides, all those whispered stories of impossible standards. And the truth was simply that Sebastian had been trying to avoid destroying another woman with his intensity. "You've been searching for someone who isn't afraid of you," she said slowly. "I've been searching for someone who will push back, who will tell me when I'm wrong, who will choose to be with me not out of fear or ambition or duty, but because she actually wants to be." His grey eyes held hers. "Do you have any idea how rare that is, Miss Blackwood? To find someone who sees past the title and the fortune and the expectations to the man underneath? I'm beginning to understand." Later that afternoon, Cecilia encountered Lady Philippa in the gallery, standing before a portrait of a woman with dark hair and sad eyes. The resemblance to both siblings was unmistakable. This must be their mother, the Duchess who had died when Sebastian was 12. "She was beautiful," Cecilia said softly, coming to stand beside Philippa. "She was miserable." Philippa's voice was flat. "She loved my father desperately, and he barely knew she existed. He was always away hunting, gambling, keeping company with other women. She spent her life waiting for him to notice her, and he never did. In the end, I think she simply gave up." "How did she die?" "Influenza, officially. But Sebastian says she stopped fighting, stopped eating, stopped caring, stopped wanting to live. She just faded away." Philippa's hand trembled slightly as she reached out to touch the frame. "He was 12. Old enough to understand what was happening, but too young to stop it. I was only 7. But I remember how he changed after she died, how he closed off, how he decided that love was a weakness he would never indulge in." Cecilia thought of her conversation with Sebastian in the conservatory, his bitter words about marriage as chains, his determination to find partnership rather than love. It all made a terrible kind of sense now. "He doesn't believe he's capable of love," she said slowly, "because he's afraid it would destroy him the way it destroyed your mother, or destroy whoever was foolish enough to love him." Philippa turned to face her, her pale eyes searching. "That's what he's really afraid of, Miss Blackwood. Not being hurt himself, but hurting someone else, like Arabella, like our mother, in a different way. He thinks his intensity, his focus, his relentlessness, he thinks it's dangerous, that anyone who gets too close will be consumed by it. And you? What do you think? Philippa was quiet for a long moment. I think he's wrong. I think he's been alone for so long that he's forgotten what it feels like to be truly seen. And I hope that you might be the one to remind him. That night at dinner, Cecilia found herself watching Sebastian with new eyes. She saw the way he checked on Philippa throughout the meal, small glances of concern that he probably thought no one noticed. She saw the patient way he conversed with elderly Lady Ashworth, drawing her out with questions about her youth. She saw the genuine warmth in his eyes when a servant accidentally spilled wine, and he dismissed it with a kind word rather than a harsh rebuke. He was not cold. That was the truth she was beginning to understand. He was guarded, careful, controlled, but underneath all of it was a man who cared deeply and was terrified of that caring. After dinner, while the other guests gathered in the drawing room for music and cards, Sebastian caught her eye and tilted his head slightly toward the door. An invitation, not a command. She hesitated only a moment before following him. They ended up in his study, a smaller room than the library, but equally lined with books. A fire burned low in the grate, casting dancing shadows across walls covered in maps and astronomical charts. A telescope stood by the window, pointed toward the sky. "You study astronomy?" Cecilia asked, surprised. "Among other things, I find comfort in the stars. They are constant, predictable. They follow patterns that can be understood and mapped." He moved to stand by the telescope, his profile sharp against the firelight. "Unlike human beings, who are endlessly complicated and impossible to comprehend." "Is that why you approach courtship so systematically? Because you're trying to make it predictable?" "Perhaps." He turned to face her. "Or perhaps I'm simply afraid of making the same mistake twice." "What mistake?" "Choosing someone who cannot survive me." His voice was barely audible. "Arabella was sweet and gentle and kind, and she is dead because I did not see how fragile she was. I have spent 8 years trying to find someone strong enough to stand beside me without breaking. Someone who would tell me no when I needed to hear it. Someone who—" He stopped abruptly, his jaw tightening. "Someone who what?" Cecilia prompted softly. "Someone who would fight for herself, rather than drown to please me." The words hung in the air between them, raw and painful. Cecilia found herself moving toward him without conscious decision, drawn by the anguish in his voice, by the weight of guilt he had carried for so long. "It wasn't your fault," she heard herself say. "What happened to Arabella? You couldn't have known." "Couldn't I?" His laugh was bitter. "I knew she was afraid of water. She told me once, when we were first courting, that she had nearly drowned as a child. But I forgot. Or perhaps I simply didn't think it mattered, because she never reminded me, never pushed back, never said, 'Sebastian, I'm frightened.' I assumed her silence meant agreement, and I was wrong, and she died for it. You were young. You made a mistake. That doesn't make you responsible for her death. Doesn't it?" He turned to face her fully, and she saw that his eyes were bright with something that might have been unshed tears. "I was 22 years old, and so certain of my own judgment. I thought I knew what was best for everyone. I thought compliance meant contentment. I thought—" His voice broke. Actually broke. Like a boy's voice breaking. Like a man finally crumbling under a weight he had carried too long. Without thinking, Cecilia reached out and took his hand. The effect was immediate. He went completely still, staring down at their joined hands as if he had never seen such a thing before. When he looked up at her, his expression was unguarded in a way she had never seen, vulnerable, bewildered, hopeful. "Why are you here?" he asked hoarsely. "You could have refused my courtship. You could have maintained your distance. Instead, you're standing in my study in the middle of the night, holding my hand and telling me that my greatest failure wasn't my fault. Why? Because I believe it, Cecilia said simply. Because I'm beginning to think that you're not the cold, calculating monster society believes you to be. Because... She stopped, unsure how to articulate the truth that was becoming clearer with every moment they spent together. Because what? He pressed. Because you make me feel seen. The words came out in a rush. For 24 years, I have cultivated invisibility because it was safer than being noticed and found wanting. I taught myself not to hope, not to dream, not to want anything for myself. And then you looked at me across a crowded ballroom and saw something. I don't know what, but you saw it, and you wanted it, and no one has ever wanted anything from me before. Sebastian's hand tightened around hers. I see strength, he said quietly. Courage. A mind that refuses to accept easy answers. I see a woman who has hidden herself because she was afraid of being hurt, and I see the fire burning underneath that camouflage. His voice dropped lower. I see someone who might actually survive me, Cecilia, and I find myself wanting that more than I have wanted anything in a very long time. It was the first time he had used her Christian name. The sound of it on his lips made something flutter in her chest. Sebastian. But she never finished the sentence, because suddenly his mouth was on hers, swallowing the sound of his name, and everything she thought she knew about herself scattered like leaves in a storm. The kiss was nothing like she had imagined a first kiss might be. It was not gentle or tentative or sweet. It was hungry, desperate, the kiss of a man who had been starving for connection and had finally found sustenance. His hands came up to cradle her face, tilting her head back, and she found herself responding with an intensity that shocked her. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Sebastian's eyes were dark, his careful control shattered. I should not have done that, he said hoarsely. You deserve better than... Don't. Cecilia pressed her fingers to his lips. Don't apologize. Don't tell me what I deserve. For once in my life, let me decide for myself what I want. And what do you want? Cecilia. She looked at him, really looked, seeing the vulnerability beneath the intensity, the fear beneath the control, the lonely man beneath the imperious duke. And she realized, with a terror that rivaled anything she had felt when Philippa whispered her warning, that she was falling in love with him. I don't know yet, she admitted, but I'm beginning to think I want to find out. The third day of their confinement dawned clear and cold, with the first hints of thaw visible in the dripping icicles and the occasional crash of ice sliding from rooftops. The storm was ending. By tomorrow, perhaps the day after, the roads would be passable. The guests would depart. Real life would resume. And Cecilia would have to decide what she wanted. She avoided Sebastian that morning, needing time to think without the distraction of his presence. She walked the portrait gallery alone, studied the frozen gardens through every window she passed, sat in the library pretending to read while her mind spun in circles. She was falling in love with him. There was no point denying it anymore. Somehow, in the space of 3 days, Sebastian Ashworth had slipped past every defense she had constructed and lodged himself firmly in her heart. His intensity, his vulnerability, his relentless honesty, all the things that should have frightened her away had instead drawn her inexorably closer. But there were also the things Lady Philippa had told her. The inheritance clause, the legal deadline, the suggestion that Sebastian's interest might be driven by necessity rather than genuine feeling. She needed to know the truth. Whatever it was, she needed to know. That afternoon, she went looking for Sebastian and found him in the study where they had kissed, standing at his desk with papers spread before him. He looked up when she entered, and his face transformed with an expression that made her heart clench. Cecilia. Just her name, but he said it like a prayer. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. "About what happens when the ice melts. About what you really want from me." Something flickered in his eyes. Wariness, perhaps, or fear. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I have heard rumors, Your Grace, about inheritance clauses and legal requirements and the necessity of marriage before some unspecified deadline." She forced herself to maintain eye contact, despite the way her heart was pounding. "I need to know if your interest in me is genuine, or if I am merely the most convenient solution to a legal problem." Sebastian went very still. Then, slowly, he sat down in the chair behind his desk and gestured for her to take the seat across from him. "Who told you?" he asked quietly. "It doesn't matter. What matters is whether it's true." "It's complicated." He ran a hand through his hair, disrupting its careful arrangement. "There is an inheritance clause, yes. My great-grandfather was apparently convinced that his descendants would be feckless wastrels who needed to be forced into responsibility, so he wrote into the family trust that each duke must marry by the age of 35 or forfeit significant portions of the estate. And you are 32. I have 3 years before the deadline becomes relevant." "Then why the urgency?" Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was not looking for a solution to a legal problem, Cecilia. I was looking for you, someone specific, someone who would challenge me and see me clearly and refuse to let me make another terrible mistake. And when I found you, He stopped, visibly struggling. "I was afraid to wait, afraid you would disappear, afraid that if I gave you too much time to think, you would realize you could do better, and I would lose you." "So you announced your courtship without giving me any choice in the matter?" "Yes." He met her eyes directly. "It was wrong. I know that. I was doing exactly what I swore I would never do, making decisions for someone else, assuming I knew what was best. I have no excuse except that I was terrified of losing something I had only just found." Cecilia sat back in her chair, processing his words. "And the conversation with your solicitor? The one about inheritance clauses and necessary marriage and deadlines? Was about protecting Philippa." His voice cracked slightly. "If I die without an heir, she loses everything. The estate, the income, the security I have tried to build for her. I was discussing provisions to ensure she would be cared for regardless of what happens to me or whether I ever marry at all." "So your interest in me has nothing to do with legal requirements?" "My interest in you," Sebastian said quietly, "has everything to do with the fact that you are the first person in 10 years to make me feel like a man instead of a title. The first person to challenge me, to argue with me, to tell me uncomfortable truths to my face. The first person who made me want to stop hiding and start living." He leaned forward, his grey eyes intense. "I am not interested in you because I need a wife, Cecilia. I am interested in you because I need you. Specifically you, the woman who saw through my facade and called my carefully constructed world a cattle market." She should have been relieved. Everything he said made sense, explained the pieces that hadn't quite fit before. But instead of relief, she felt a growing horror as she realized the implications of his words. He needed her. He had chosen her. He had locked the doors and kept her trapped, and announced his courtship without her consent, because he was afraid of losing her. And she had been so busy falling in love with him that she had failed to notice the warning signs. "You locked the doors," she said slowly. "The night of the ball. Before the ice storm really hit, before the roads became impassable, you had the doors locked." Sebastian's face went pale. The storm was a convenient excuse, but the locks engaged before we had any word of the weather. I remember because Philippa was warning me, telling me to run, and when I turned toward the doors, they were already closing. Cecilia's voice rose. You trapped me here, Sebastian. You took away my choice before I even knew I had one to make. I was trying to protect you. From what? From leaving? From escaping before you could convince me to stay? She stood abruptly, her chair scraping back against the floor. You said you wanted someone who would push back, who would tell you no. But what happens when I do tell you no? Will you lock the doors again? Will you find another convenient excuse to keep me trapped until I agree to what you want? Cecilia, please. You talk about Arabella and how she died because she couldn't refuse you, because she was too afraid to push back. But don't you see? This is exactly the same thing. You're making decisions for me, controlling my options, deciding what's best without asking what I actually want. Tears were pricking at her eyes now. I thought you were different. I thought you understood. But you're just like everyone else, assuming you know better, assuming that my choices don't matter as long as you get the outcome you've decided on. That's not I didn't. Sebastian rose too, reaching for her. Cecilia, I love you. The words hung in the air between them, raw and desperate, and far too late. You don't believe in love, Cecilia said flatly. You told me so yourself. You believe in partnership and convenience and finding someone strong enough to survive your intensity. Well, congratulations, Your Grace. You found someone strong enough to walk away. She turned and fled the study before he could respond, nearly colliding with a maid in the corridor, taking the stairs 2 at a time toward her room, where she could lock the door and fall apart in private. She thought she heard him calling her name behind her, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. If she stopped, she might listen to his explanations, might let herself be convinced, might surrender her will to his the way Arabella had done, the way his mother had done, the way every woman in his life seemed destined to do. She had spent her whole life being invisible. She would not spend the rest of it being controlled. The morning of the 4th day dawned with clear skies and rapidly melting ice. The roads would be passable by afternoon. The guests were already beginning to pack. Cecilia moved through the preparations mechanically, avoiding Sebastian's eyes across the breakfast table, ignoring her mother's increasingly frantic questions about what had gone wrong, deflecting Helena's gentle attempts to discover why her sister had been crying all night. Lady Philippa found her in the garden, bundled against the cold, staring at the frozen fountain that was just beginning to drip. He told me what happened, Philippa said quietly. About the doors, about what you said. And? And you were right. It was wrong of him. He knows that now. Philippa moved to stand beside her, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. But Cecilia, may I call you Cecilia? There's something you should know. Something I didn't tell you before because I was trying to let Sebastian tell you himself. I don't want to hear any more excuses for his behavior. This isn't an excuse. It's an explanation. Philippa took a deep breath. The doors weren't locked because Sebastian ordered it. They were locked because I did. Cecilia turned to stare at her. What? I was watching from the gallery when you spoke to him that first time. I saw his face, the way it changed when you challenged him. And I was so desperate for him to find happiness, so terrified that you would leave and he would retreat back into his shell, that I... Her voice broke. I told the butler that His Grace wanted the doors secured. I lied. Sebastian didn't even know until after you were all in bed. But he defended it because he didn't want me to face the consequences. He took the blame because that's what he does. He protects the people he loves, even when it makes him look like a monster. Philippa's eyes were bright with tears. He didn't trap you, Cecilia. I did. And I am so, so sorry. Cecilia felt the ground shift beneath her feet. all her certainty, all her righteous anger, all the careful logic she had constructed to justify walking away, it was all based on a lie she had believed without question. Why are you telling me this? Because my brother is destroying himself over you. Because he spent all night writing you a letter that he tore up because nothing he said seemed adequate. Because I have never seen him like this, so completely undone, and I can't bear to watch him retreat back into his cold, controlled existence when there was finally someone who could reach him. He said he loved me. Cecilia's voice was barely a whisper. After telling me he didn't believe in love. He didn't believe in it. Until you. Philippa reached out and took Cecilia's hand. He's terrified, Cecilia. Terrified of needing someone the way his mother needed his father. Terrified of loving someone the way Arabella loved him and destroying them with that love. But he loves you anyway. Against his will, against his reason, against everything he told himself he would never feel. He loves you, and he let you believe he was the villain rather than expose me. Cecilia closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. All her careful walls, all her protective invisibility, all her certainty that she knew what was happening, and she had been completely, utterly wrong. I don't know what to do, she admitted. Go to him. Talk to him. Give him a chance to explain without taking the blame for my mistakes. Philippa squeezed her hand. Whatever you decide after that, at least it will be based on truth rather than lies. The study door was closed. Cecilia stood before it for a long moment, gathering her courage. Then she knocked. Enter. He was sitting in the same chair where they had first talked, but he looked nothing like the commanding duke she had met at the ball. His hair was disordered, his cravat missing, his shirt rumpled as if he had slept in it. When he looked up and saw her, his face went through a series of expressions too fast to catalogue hope, fear, longing, resignation. You're leaving, he said flatly. I understand. I'll send word to the stables to prepare your carriage. Philippa told me the truth. Cecilia stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. About the doors. About who really gave the order. Sebastian went very still. She shouldn't have... Why? Why take the blame for something you didn't do? Because I would have done it. His voice was barely audible. If I had thought of it. That's the truth, Cecilia. I didn't give the order, but I was grateful for it. Grateful to have more time with you. Grateful for the excuse to keep you close. He looked away, his jaw tight. You were right about me. I am controlling. I do make decisions for other people without considering their wishes. The only difference is that this time, someone else acted on those impulses before I could. That's not... She stopped, frustrated. Why are you so determined to paint yourself as the villain? Because I am one. He laughed bitterly. Do you know what I thought when I first saw you at the ball? I thought, there, that one. Like selecting a horse or a painting. One moment of recognition, and I had decided your entire future without asking what you wanted. That's not love, Cecilia. That's possession. Is it? She moved closer, stopping just out of arm's reach. Or is it recognition? Seeing something in someone else that calls to something in yourself? Is wanting connection really the same as wanting control? In my case, perhaps. What if I don't believe that? His eyes met hers, confused. What do you mean? I mean that I've spent the past 12 hours being furious at you, certain that you were exactly the cold, controlling monster I always feared, ready to walk away and never look back. She took a shaky breath. And then Philippa told me the truth, and I realized that all my anger was based on a lie, that you had taken the blame to protect your sister, just like you've spent your whole life protecting everyone but yourself. That doesn't change what I am, What you are, Cecilia said firmly, is a man who is terrified of his own capacity for love because everyone he has loved has been hurt by it. Your mother, Arabella. You keep yourself controlled and distant because you're convinced that your intensity will destroy anyone who gets too close. She took another step toward him. But Sebastian, I am not your mother. I am not Arabella. I am a woman who spent 24 years making herself invisible because she was too afraid to be seen, and you saw me anyway. You looked past all my camouflage and found something worth wanting. How can you expect me to walk away from that? Because I will hurt you. His voice cracked. Inevitably. I am too much, too intense, too demanding, too afraid to let yourself be loved. Cecilia closed the distance between them and took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. I'm not afraid of you, Sebastian. I'm not afraid of your intensity. The only thing I'm afraid of is spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I had been brave enough to stay. For a long moment, he simply stared at her. Then something in his face crumpled, and he pulled her into his arms with a desperation that took her breath away. I love you, he said against her hair. I know I said I didn't believe in it, but I was wrong. I was so wrong. I love you, Cecilia, and I don't know how to stop, and I'm terrified that I'll destroy you with it. Then let me teach you. She pulled back enough to look at him. Let me teach you that love doesn't have to mean destruction. That intensity can be matched with intensity. That two people can see each other completely and still choose to stay. You would do that? After everything? I would do that, she said softly, because I love you too. Even when you infuriate me. Even when you make decisions without consulting me. Even when you take blame that isn't yours to take. She smiled through her tears. I love you, Sebastian Ashworth. And I'm not going anywhere. He kissed her, then not the hungry, desperate kiss of before, but something gentler. A promise. A beginning. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. I should do this properly, he murmured, with your mother's blessing, and announcements in the papers, and all the appropriate formalities. Probably, Cecilia agreed. But Sebastian? Yes? She smiled up at him, her heart fuller than she had ever imagined it could be. The next time you want to keep me somewhere, just ask. I suspect you'll find I'm more willing to stay than you expect. His answering smile was like the sun breaking through clouds, unexpected, transformative, beautiful. I'll remember that, he said, and kissed her again. The ball was a disaster. That was the only word for it. 3 weeks later, at the Thorntons' winter gathering, Cecilia stood in the receiving line with Sebastian, their engagement newly announced, and society absolutely buzzing with speculation. The invisible Blackwood sister, snagging the season's most eligible bachelor. Half the ton was convinced there must be some scandal involved. The other half was simply jealous. The whispers followed them everywhere. But for once in her life, Cecilia didn't care about being watched. Not when Sebastian's hand rested warm and steady at the small of her back. Not when he looked at her across crowded rooms with an expression that made her feel like the only person who existed. They're still staring, she murmured as they moved through the crowd. Let them stare. His voice was low, meant only for her. They can gossip all they want. I don't care what any of them think. That's rather a change from the man who spent 8 seasons being inspected by every ambitious mama in London. That man didn't have you. His fingers traced a small circle against her back. Now I find I have very little interest in anyone else's opinion. How very romantic. I thought you said I didn't believe in romance. You didn't. She looked up at him, smiling. I believe I'm having a positive influence. Before he could respond, A commotion near the entrance drew their attention. Lady Philippa stood in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically bright-eyed, her hand clasped in that of a tall, nervous-looking young man with spectacles and an ink stain on his collar. "Is that—" Cecilia started. "Mr. Edward Hartley," Sebastian said, his voice carefully neutral. "A historian. He's been helping catalogue the Ravenswood archives. And holding your sister's hand in public, apparently." Sebastian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "So I see." Cecilia reached up and touched his cheek, drawing his attention back to her. "Breathe," she said softly. "She's 19. She's allowed to have feelings. She's my little sister. And you're her overprotective brother. But perhaps, just perhaps, she might benefit from having someone who sees her as more than a fragile creature to be guarded." She raised an eyebrow. "Sound familiar?" Sebastian stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, the tension drained from his shoulders. "I hate it when you're right," he muttered. "You love it when I'm right. You just haven't admitted it yet." His lips twitched. "Perhaps." From across the room, Philippa caught Cecilia's eye and gave a tiny, hopeful wave. Cecilia waved back, then turned to her future husband with a smile. "Come," she said. "I believe you need to meet the young man who's been making your sister blush. Try not to terrify him too badly. I make no promises. Sebastian." He sighed, but there was affection in it. "Fine. I will try not to terrify him too badly. But if he makes her unhappy, then we'll deal with it. Together." She squeezed his hand. "That's rather the point of partnership, isn't it?" He looked at her for a long moment, something soft and wondering in his eyes. "Have I mentioned that I love you? Not in the last hour, at least. Grievous oversight." He bent to press a kiss to her temple, scandalously intimate for a public gathering. "I love you, Cecilia Blackwood. I love you too." She took his arm and steered him toward where Philippa and her blushing suitor waited. "Now come and be civilized." "As my lady commands," he murmured, and together they walked into their future. The gossip would continue. Society would whisper. But for the first time in her life, Cecilia found she didn't mind being seen. Not when the person who saw her most clearly was the one who loved her best. She had spent 24 years being invisible. She had no intention of being invisible ever again. The scandal broke 3 days before the wedding. Cecilia was in the morning room of her family's modest townhouse, reviewing the final guest list with her mother, when the letter arrived. It was addressed to Mrs. Blackwood, written in an elegant feminine hand that Cecilia did not recognize, and its contents made her mother go white as bone. "What is it?" Cecilia reached for the letter, but her mother pulled it away, her hands trembling. "Nothing. A misunderstanding. I'll handle it." "Mamma." "It's nothing, Cecilia. Just wedding nerves. Everyone has them." But her mother's voice was too high, too brittle, and her eyes kept darting to the letter as if it might burst into flames at any moment. Cecilia felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "Give me the letter, Mamma." "Cecilia. Now." Her mother's resistance crumpled. She handed over the paper with shaking fingers, her face a mask of barely controlled terror. The letter was brief and devastating. "Dear Mrs. Blackwood, it has come to my attention that your daughter is soon to wed the Duke of Ravenswood. I feel it my Christian duty to inform you of certain facts regarding His Grace that may influence your family's decision. 10 years ago, Miss Arabella Crane did not drown by accident. She took her own life, walking deliberately into the lake at Ravenswood Manor after learning that her betrothed intended to break their engagement. The local magistrate, a friend of the late Duke, ruled it an accident to spare the family scandal. But there were witnesses. There is evidence. I trust you will use this information wisely. A mother must protect her children after all. A friend. Cecilia read the letter twice, then a third time, the words blurring before her eyes. Arabella had not drowned accidentally. She had walked into the lake deliberately, because Sebastian had been going to break their engagement, because he had been going to reject her, as he had rejected so many others after. "It could be lies," her mother said desperately. "Malicious gossip from someone who wants to prevent the match. There are dozens of young ladies who are hoping to catch the Duke themselves." "It could be lies," Cecilia agreed. Her voice sounded strange and distant in her own ears. "Or it could be the truth that Sebastian has been hiding all along. You cannot confront him with this. If you accuse a duke of concealing a suicide, of allowing false testimony to a magistrate, Cecilia, think of the consequences. Even if it's true, exposing it would ruin us all. And if I say nothing? If I marry him knowing that he might have—" She stopped, unable to complete the thought. "I have to know, Mama. Whatever the consequences, I have to know the truth." She found Sebastian at his solicitor's office, reviewing contracts for the marriage settlement. He looked up when she entered, his face lighting with the warmth that still made her heart flutter despite everything. But then he saw her expression, and the warmth faded into concern. "What's wrong?" Cecilia handed him the letter without a word. She watched his face as he read it, watched the colour drain from his cheeks, watched his jaw clench tight, watched his hands begin to tremble almost imperceptibly. When he finally looked up, his eyes were haunted. "Where did you get this?" "It was sent to my mother, anonymously." She forced herself to maintain eye contact despite the sick churning in her stomach. "Is it true?" "Cecilia, is it true?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Sebastian's throat worked as he swallowed. "Yes," he said finally. "And no. Explain." He set down the letter and moved to the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Arabella did walk into the lake deliberately. That much is true. She had learned—" He stopped, took a breath. "She had learned that I was planning to speak to her father about ending our engagement. I had realized, in the weeks before the wedding, that something was terribly wrong. She had become increasingly anxious, increasingly fearful. She barely ate. She couldn't sleep. I hoped that if I released her from the engagement, she might find happiness with someone else, someone gentler, someone who didn't frighten her the way I apparently did. But she found out before you could speak to her father. One of the servants told her, trying to be kind, I think, warning her to prepare herself." His laugh was bitter. Arabella was not prepared. She was devastated, does not begin to describe it. She came to me in tears, begging me not to leave her, saying that she loved me, that she could not live without me, that she would do anything. His voice broke. I told her that my mind was made up, that I thought it was better for both of us, that she deserved someone who could make her happy in a way I clearly could not. And then? And then she walked out of the room, walked down to the lake, and walked into the water. He turned to face her, and there were tears on his cheeks. I was the one who found her. I pulled her out. I tried. He stopped, his face crumpling. I tried everything, but she was already gone. Cecilia felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This was not the story she had expected. Not the tale of a cold, calculating man driving a fragile woman to suicide. This was something more complicated, more tragic, more human. "Why did you hide it?" she asked quietly. "Why let the magistrate rule it an accident?" "Because her family asked me to. Her parents were destroyed by what she had done. They begged me to protect her reputation, to let the world believe it was a tragic accident rather than... He struggled to find words. They said they could not bear for her to be remembered as someone who had taken her own life. They wanted her to be remembered as sweet and gentle and beloved. And I felt I owed them that much, after what I had done. What you had done. Sebastian, you were trying to release her from an engagement that was making her miserable. I was trying to save myself from a marriage I knew would be a disaster. His voice was raw. Don't make me into a hero, Cecilia. I saw how unhappy she was, and instead of trying to help her, I decided the easiest solution was to end things entirely. I didn't consider what that would do to her. I didn't think about how she might interpret my rejection. I was 22 years old and utterly convinced that I knew what was best for everyone. You were trying to do the right thing. I was trying to escape. There's a difference. He met her eyes directly. The truth is that I did drive Arabella to her death. Not through cruelty, perhaps, but through carelessness, through certainty. Through my absolute conviction that ending the engagement was the correct course of action without ever considering that she might disagree violently enough to... He couldn't finish the sentence. Cecilia was silent for a long moment, processing everything he had told her. The letter's accusations were true. In a sense, Sebastian had concealed the real circumstances of Arabella's death. But the story behind those circumstances was far more nuanced than the anonymous correspondent had implied. "Who sent this?" she asked finally. "Who would know the truth and want to expose it now, 3 days before our wedding?" "I don't know. The servants who witnessed it have all been pensioned off or moved away. The magistrate died years ago. The only people who know the full story are myself, Arabella's parents, and..." He stopped abruptly. And Arabella's sister. His voice had changed, become harder. "Miss Catherine Crane. She was 15 when it happened. She never believed the official story, and she has hated me ever since." "Where is she now?" "Married. Mrs. Catherine Hartley, wife of a respectable solicitor, living in London." His face had gone very still. "She has a son, a young man who studied history at Oxford, a young man who recently began helping to catalogue the Ravenswood archives." Cecilia felt a chill run through her. "Edward Hartley? Philippa's Edward?" "Yes." The implications were staggering. If Catherine Hartley had sent her son to Ravenswood to dig up old secrets, if she had orchestrated his relationship with Philippa as a way to get close to the family. "Does Philippa know?" Cecilia asked. "I don't believe so. The connection to the Cranes is not obvious. Hartley is a common enough name, and Edward was apparently raised abroad until recently." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "But if Catherine is behind this letter, then her son's presence in my household is unlikely to be a coincidence. We have to tell Philippa." "I know." He looked older suddenly, worn down by the weight of secrets and consequences. "I know. But first..." He crossed the room and took her hands in his grip desperate. "First, I need to know if this changes things. Between us. If learning what I did, what I concealed..." "Sebastian." Cecilia squeezed his hands. "You made a decision 10 years ago that had consequences you could never have predicted. You were young and careless and convinced of your own rightness. That doesn't make you a murderer. It makes you human. I destroyed a woman's life. You tried to release her from an engagement that was making her miserable. You couldn't have known how she would react." She reached up to touch his face. "I'm not saying it wasn't a tragedy. I'm not saying you don't bear some responsibility. But Sebastian, you have spent 10 years punishing yourself for something that was ultimately her choice. Arabella chose to walk into that lake. You did not push her. I might as well have." "No." Her voice was firm. "No. You do not get to claim ownership of her decision. She made a choice, a terrible, tragic choice, and you have been carrying the guilt of it ever since. But her choice was hers, just as your choice to end the engagement was yours." He stared at her, something crumbling in his expression. "How can you say that?" "After everything I've told you. Because I see you clearly, Sebastian Ashworth. I see the guilt you carry, and the walls you've built, and the man underneath who has spent a decade trying to atone for something that was never entirely his fault." She took a shaky breath. "I love you. That hasn't changed. And I will not let some anonymous letter destroy what we have built together. Even knowing what I am, especially knowing what you are. A man. A flawed, complicated, haunted man who is trying to be better." She smiled through her tears. "I didn't fall in love with a perfect duke. I fell in love with you." He kissed her, then fierce and desperate, and full of a hope she had not seen in him before. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "We still have to deal with this," he said quietly. "The letter. Whoever sent it, if they're willing to expose the truth now, they won't stop at anonymous accusations. Then we face it together." Cecilia pulled back enough to look at him. "Whatever comes, whatever they try, we face it together." "Together," he echoed. "I'm not certain I know how to do that." "Neither am I." She smiled slightly. "I suppose we'll learn." The confrontation with Edward Hartley happened that evening. Sebastian had summoned the young man to his study under the pretext of discussing the archive project. Philippa was there as well, sitting pale and silent in a corner, her eyes huge with shock after Sebastian had gently explained the connection between her suitor and the Crane family. "I didn't know," Edward said immediately, his face flushed with distress. "I swear to you, Your Grace, I had no idea about any of this until my mother's letter arrived yesterday." "Your mother wrote to you?" Sebastian's voice was carefully controlled. "She told me everything, about Arabella, about what really happened." Edward's hands were shaking. "She said I had a duty to the family to help expose the truth. That's why she sent me here in the first place. She heard the Duke was looking for someone to catalogue the archives, and she thought I might find evidence of—" He stopped, apparently unable to articulate what evidence he was supposed to have found. "Evidence of what, exactly?" Cecilia asked. "Murder? Your aunt walked into the lake of her own accord. My mother believes it was the Duke's fault, that he drove Arabella to it with his coldness, his rejection." Edward's eyes darted to Sebastian. "She has spent 15 years believing that you destroyed her sister and escaped without consequences." "I have not escaped consequences." Sebastian's voice was quiet. "I have lived with what happened every day since. I have searched for 8 years to find someone strong enough to survive me, so that I would never again be responsible for another woman's destruction. I have built my entire existence around the guilt of that night." He met Edward's gaze directly. "Tell me, Mr. Hartley, is that escaping without consequences?" Edward was silent. "Your mother has sent an anonymous letter attempting to destroy my marriage 3 days before the wedding," Sebastian continued. "She has sent her son into my household as a spy. She has apparently encouraged you to cultivate a relationship with my sister as a means of getting close to my family." His voice hardened. "These are not the actions of a grieving woman seeking justice. These are the actions of someone seeking revenge." "I didn't cultivate anything," Edward said, his voice cracking. "Philippa, my feelings for Philippa are real. I never meant to hurt her. I never meant to hurt anyone." From her corner, Philippa made a small sound that might have been a sob. "I believe you," Sebastian said, surprising everyone in the room. "I believe that you came here with your mother's agenda, but that you fell genuinely in love with my sister along the way. The question is what you intend to do about it. What do you mean? I mean that you have a choice to make, Mr. Hartley. You can continue to serve your mother's vendetta, help her expose secrets that will ruin my family and by extension your own hoped-for connection to it. Or you can tell your mother that you will not be party to her schemes and accept whatever consequences that brings. Sebastian's eyes were steady. I am not asking you to betray your family. I am asking you to decide what kind of man you want to be. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Edward turned to look at Philippa, his expression anguished. I love you, he said quietly. I know I have no right to say that after what my mother has done. But I love you, Philippa, and I cannot. I will not be the instrument of your brother's destruction. Philippa rose from her chair, her face tear-streaked but resolute. She crossed the room to stand before Edward, reaching up to touch his cheek. Then prove it, she said. Help us stop your mother. Help us end this before it ruins everyone. Mrs. Catherine Hartley was a handsome woman in her early 30s, with the same delicate bone structure that had apparently characterized her late sister. She received them in the drawing-room of her modest but respectable townhouse, her expression a carefully crafted mask of dignified surprise. Your Grace, she said coolly, I confess I did not expect a visit. And Miss Blackwood, I congratulate you on your impending marriage. You must be so pleased with yourself. I am pleased to be marrying a man I love, Cecilia said evenly. I understand you have some objections to the match. Objections? Catherine's laugh was brittle. I have rather more than objections, Miss Blackwood. I have the truth about what the Duke did to my sister. We know what happened to Arabella. Sebastian's voice was quiet. I have carried that knowledge for 10 years, and I have told Cecilia everything, the engagement, my decision to end it, what Arabella did afterwards, and the decision to rule it an accident. The decision to cover up a suicide, you mean? The decision to let everyone believe my sister died in a tragic accident rather than admit that your cruelty drove her to walk into that lake. My cruelty? Sebastian stepped forward. Mrs. Hartley, I was trying to release your sister from an engagement that was making her desperately unhappy. I saw how anxious she had become, how frightened. Frightened of you. Yes, frightened of me. And I thought the kindest thing I could do was set her free. His voice cracked slightly. I was wrong. I should have spoken to her directly instead of going through her father. I should have recognized the signs of something deeper than mere nervousness. But I was 22 years old and utterly certain of my own judgment, and I failed her. You killed her. She killed herself. The words hung in the air, raw and terrible. I know you do not want to hear that. I know it is easier to blame me than to accept that Arabella made a choice, a final, irrevocable choice that no one could have prevented. But I cannot take responsibility for a decision that was not mine to make. Catherine's mask cracked, revealing the grief and rage beneath. She was my sister. She was sweet and gentle and good, and she is dead because of you. She is dead because she could not bear the thought of being rejected. Because her entire sense of self-worth was tied to our engagement, and when that engagement ended, she believed she had nothing left to live for. Sebastian's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I have asked myself 1,000 times what I could have done differently. I have tortured myself with what-ifs and if-onlys. But the truth is that I cannot undo what happened. I can only try to live with it. And you expect me to simply accept that? To watch you marry another woman and live happily ever after while my sister rots in the ground? I expect nothing. His voice softened. But I hope that you might consider the possibility of peace. Your son loves my sister. He has told us he will not be party to your vendetta. You can continue to fight a battle that will only destroy the people you claim to love, or you can accept that the past cannot be changed and try to build something better. Pretty words from a man who has never faced consequences. I have faced consequences every day since Arabella died. Sebastian met her eyes directly. The question is whether you want revenge badly enough to destroy your son's happiness and your own chance at a future grandson who might carry something of your sister's legacy. Catherine's face crumpled. For a moment, she looked not like a vengeful adversary, but like what she truly was, a woman who had lost her sister too young and had spent 15 years unable to move past it. "She was everything to me," she whispered. "When our parents died, she was all I had left. And then you took her away." "I know." Sebastian's voice was gentle now. "I know. And I am sorry. I am so deeply, profoundly sorry." The silence stretched between them, heavy with grief and years of accumulated pain. Then, slowly, Catherine's rigid posture began to soften. "She would have been an aunt by now," she said quietly. "She always wanted to be an aunt. She would have spoiled my children terribly. She would have been wonderful at it. Yes, she would have." Catherine closed her eyes. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can ever stop blaming you for what happened. But my son—" Her voice broke. "Edward is a good man. He loves your sister. And I will not let my hatred destroy his chance at happiness. Then let us end this." Sebastian extended his hand. "Not as friends, not with forgiveness that neither of us may be capable of offering, but with acceptance, with peace, with the recognition that we have both suffered enough." Catherine stared at his hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. "Peace," she said quietly. "I suppose I can try." The wedding took place on a cold, clear December morning, 3 days after it had originally been scheduled. The delay had been explained away as a minor family emergency, and society had accepted the excuse without too much speculation. Cecilia stood at the altar of St. George's, Hanover Square, watching Sebastian's face as the vicar read the marriage service. He looked younger somehow, as if the confrontation with Catherine Hartley had lifted a weight he had been carrying for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. "Wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband?" the vicar intoned. "I will," Cecilia said, her voice clear and strong. "Wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife?" "I will." Sebastian's eyes never left hers. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of sacred words and sacred promises. When Sebastian finally kissed her a proper, dignified, church-appropriate kiss, she heard her mother weeping quietly, and Helena sniffling into her handkerchief, and Lady Philippa laughing through her tears. They were married. Against all odds, against all obstacles, against the ghosts of the past and the machinations of the present, they were married. "I love you," Sebastian murmured against her lips. "I know," Cecilia whispered back. "I love you too." They walked down the aisle together, husband and wife, into a future neither of them had ever dared to imagine. The wedding breakfast was held at Ravenswood Manor, which had been transformed from the forbidding fortress of that first night into something warmer, more welcoming. Fires burned in every grate. Flowers filled every available surface. The guests, a carefully curated mix of family, friends, and the cream of society, circulated through rooms that seemed to glow with candlelight and happiness. Cecilia found herself standing by the tall windows of the ballroom, watching the winter garden beyond as snowflakes began to drift down from a darkening sky. So much had changed since that first night, when she had stood by different windows looking out at ice and feeling trapped. "You're thinking about the ball," Sebastian said, appearing at her shoulder. "I'm thinking about how different everything is now." She leaned back against him, feeling his arms come around her waist. "That night, I was so certain I understood what was happening. The cold Duke, the locked doors, the cryptic warnings. I thought I knew who you were. And now? Now I know I was wrong about almost everything. She turned in his arms to face him. You're not cold. You're not controlling. You're just a man who has been hurt so badly that he built walls to protect himself and everyone else from ever being hurt that way again. You make me sound noble. I assure you I am nothing of the kind. You're not noble. You're human. She smiled up at him. It's much better. He kissed her forehead, a tender gesture that made her heart clench. I keep waiting to wake up and discover this was all a dream, that you'll realize you've made a terrible mistake and flee into the night. The doors aren't locked this time. No. His lips curved. They're not. Then I suppose I stay because I choose to. She reached up to touch his face. Because I love you. Because you see me clearly, and you love what you see. Because you make me feel like I matter. You do matter. You matter more than anything. Across the room, Philippa was dancing with Edward Hartley, her face glowing with a happiness that had survived the revelation of his mother's schemes. Mrs. Hartley herself had sent a stiff but sincere letter of congratulation, the first step on a long road towards something that might eventually resemble acceptance. Helena was laughing with a group of young people near the refreshment table, her arm linked through that of Mr. James Whitfield, the country gentleman she had secretly loved for years, whom she was now free to court openly, thanks to her sister's brilliant match. Their mother circulated through the crowd like a triumphant general, accepting congratulations and basking in the reflected glory of having produced a duchess. "It's strange," Cecilia said quietly. "A month ago, I was invisible. The spinster sister, the one who watched from the shadows while everyone else lived their lives. And now you are the Duchess of Ravenswood, seen by everyone. Now I am myself." She smiled. "That's the real change, Sebastian. Not the title or the position or the sudden social prominence. The real change is that I stopped hiding. I stopped making myself small and invisible because I was afraid of being noticed and found wanting." "You were never wanting." His voice was fierce. "Never. You were always extraordinary. You simply needed someone to see it." "I needed to see it myself." She kissed him softly. "You helped. But in the end, I had to choose to stop being invisible. I had to choose to be seen. And now? Now I intend to be seen for the rest of my life." She grinned. "Starting with this waltz. Dance with me, husband." He swept her onto the floor with a grace that belied his reputation for coldness, holding her close as the music swelled around them. They moved together as if they had been dancing all their lives, two people who had somehow found each other despite every obstacle the world had thrown in their path. "I love you," Cecilia whispered. "I love you," Sebastian replied. And as the snow fell softly outside the windows of Ravenswood Manor, they danced their first dance as husband and wife, surrounded by the people who loved them, carrying the weight of the past, but looking forward to the future. The future, Cecilia thought, had never looked brighter. 7 years later, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the halls of Ravenswood Manor, a noise that would have been unthinkable in the cold, silent house of 7 years ago. Cecilia stood at the window of her private sitting room, watching as her eldest son chased his twin brother across the frost-covered lawn, while their father gave chase with considerably less speed and considerably more dramatic threats of capture. "Mama, Mama, Papa says he's going to throw us in the lake if we don't come inside." This from 5-year-old William, the elder twin by 7 minutes, a fact he reminded his brother of at every possible opportunity. His dark hair was dishevelled, his cheeks flushed with cold, and his grey eyes sparkled with the mischief that was his father's legacy. "Your papa would never throw you in the lake," Cecilia called back through the open window. "He has a complicated relationship with lakes." From across the garden, Sebastian shot her a look that was equal parts amusement and mock offence. "I am not going to throw anyone in the lake. I was merely suggesting that the lake might be cold this time of year, and anyone who doesn't come inside for supper might end up taking an involuntary swim." "That's basically the same thing," the younger twin, James, pointed out with the devastating logic of a 5-year-old. "You said you would throw us." "I said nothing of the kind. I said—" "Sebastian." Cecilia's voice was fond. "Stop threatening the children with aquatic punishment and bring them inside. Supper is nearly ready." "Your mother has spoken," Sebastian announced gravely. "We must obey. The Duchess's word is law." The twins raced toward the house with the boundless energy of small children, leaving their father to follow at a more dignified pace. Cecilia turned from the window to find her daughter standing in the doorway, watching the scene with the serious expression that characterized most of her interactions with the world. At 3 years old, Charlotte Ashworth was a miniature version of her mother, honey brown hair, hazel eyes, a tendency to observe before acting. She had inherited none of her father's intensity and all of his stubbornness, a combination that made her simultaneously delightful and exhausting. "Is Papa being silly again?" Charlotte asked. "Papa is always silly with your brothers. He can't help himself. I prefer when he reads to me." Charlotte crossed the room and climbed onto the settee beside her mother with the careful deliberation of a child who took her dignity very seriously. "He does the voices properly." "He does," Cecilia agreed. "Your papa is excellent at voices." The door burst open, and the twins tumbled in, followed by Sebastian, who was pretending to be winded, despite being in excellent physical condition. He collapsed dramatically into a chair near the fire, groaning. "Your sons have defeated me. I am vanquished. I shall never recover." "You shall recover in approximately 10 minutes when Mrs. Henderson serves the roast beef," Cecilia said dryly. "Your appetite has never been affected by vanquishment." "Heartless woman." "I married a heartless woman." "You married a woman who knows you too well." She smiled at him, that particular smile she reserved for moments when the happiness of her life felt almost overwhelming. "Boys, go wash your hands. Charlotte, you too. We'll have supper in the small dining room tonight." The children departed in a thunder of footsteps and excited chatter, leaving Sebastian and Cecilia alone for the first time since that morning. He rose from his chair and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms with the ease of long familiarity. "Have I mentioned today that I love you?" "Several times, but I never tire of hearing it." "Good, because I intend to keep saying it until I run out of breath, which should be approximately never." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I received a letter from Catherine Hartley today. She's asking if Edward and Philippa might bring the children to visit next month." Cecilia smiled. In the 7 years since their wedding, Catherine Hartley had transformed from bitter adversary to distant relation to something approaching genuine family. She had watched her son marry Philippa in a quiet ceremony 2 years after Sebastian and Cecilia's wedding, and she had wept with joy at the birth of her first grandchild. The past had not been forgotten, but it had been layered over with new memories, new connections, new love. Of course they should visit. Charlotte has been asking about her cousin for weeks. Charlotte asks about everything for weeks. That child has inherited your curiosity and my persistence. It's a terrifying combination. She will be a force of nature when she's grown. She already is. Sebastian's arms tightened around her. They all are. Sometimes I look at our children and I cannot believe they're real. That this life is real. That I somehow stumbled into exactly the happiness I convinced myself I could never have. You didn't stumble into it. You chose it. Cecilia pulled back enough to look at him. You chose to take a chance on an invisible spinster who insulted your hospitality. You chose to be honest with me despite the risk. You chose love over fear, even when loving me meant confronting everything you had spent a decade running from. You make it sound like I had noble motivations. I was mostly just terrified of losing you. Fear of loss can be its own kind of bravery. She touched his face gently. I was terrified too. Terrified of being seen. Terrified of being found wanting. Terrified of letting someone in after years of keeping everyone out. And now? Now I am the least terrified person I know. She smiled. Well, perhaps a little terrified. We do have 3 children who seem determined to give me grey hair before I'm 40. You will be beautiful with grey hair. Flatterer. Truth-teller. He kissed her properly then, the kind of kiss that still made her heart race after 7 years of marriage. I love you, Cecilia Ashworth, Duchess of Ravenswood, mother of my children, the woman who saw past everything I showed the world and loved what she found underneath. I love you too, Sebastian Ashworth, collector of antiquities and hearts, the man who looked at an invisible woman and made her feel seen for the first time in her life. From somewhere down the hall, the sound of children arguing drifted toward them. William insisting it was his turn to sit next to Papa at supper, James countering that William always got to sit next to Papa, Charlotte announcing with queenly disdain that she didn't care where she sat as long as everyone stopped shouting. Sebastian groaned. Duty calls. Duty always calls when you have children. Is it wrong that sometimes I miss the quiet? Cecilia laughed. You don't miss the quiet. You love every chaotic, noisy, exhausting moment of this life. I do, he admitted. God help me, I do. They walked toward the dining room together, hand in hand, to settle the children's disputes and share a meal and continue building the life they had created against all odds. The house that had once felt like a prison now felt like home. The man who had once seemed like a captor now felt like a partner, a lover, a friend. Later that evening, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Cecilia and Sebastian walked together to the lake at the edge of the estate. The water was still in the moonlight, dark and peaceful. Nothing like the site of tragedy it had been so many years ago. A small memorial garden had been planted on the shore, where Arabella Crane's favourite flowers bloomed every spring. It had been Cecilia's idea, a way of honouring the past without being trapped by it. Sebastian tended it himself, a private act of atonement that had gradually become an act of healing. The children want to learn to swim next summer, Sebastian said quietly. All 3 of them. I know. William has been talking about it constantly. I thought... He paused, struggling with words that clearly cost him something. I thought I might teach them, if you think that's appropriate. Cecilia looked at him, seeing the vulnerability beneath the offer. For 7 years, he had avoided this lake except for his visits to the memorial garden. He had never swum here, never boated here, never allowed the children to play near the water unsupervised. I think it's time, she said softly. I think Arabella would want you to make new memories here. Happy ones, lives ones. You believe that? I do. She took his hand, and they stood together at the water's edge, looking out at the moonlit surface. She loved you, Sebastian, in her way, however imperfectly, and I don't think she would want you to spend the rest of your life avoiding everything that reminds you of her. I have spent so long feeling guilty. I know, and you may always carry some of that guilt. It's part of who you are now. But guilt doesn't have to mean avoiding joy. It doesn't have to mean refusing to let your children splash in the lake on hot summer days. He was quiet for a long moment, his hand tight in hers. Then, slowly, he nodded. Next summer, he said. Swimming lessons. I'll teach them. All 3? All 3. And you too, if you'd like. You never did learn properly, as I recall. You recall correctly. My family could never afford lessons. Then I'll teach you too. He turned to face her, his expression soft in the moonlight. We'll make this place a happy one. Together. Together, Cecilia agreed. They stood there for a while longer, watching the stars reflect on the water's surface, thinking about the past and the future and the precious, fleeting present. 7 years of marriage, 3 children, a family that had seemed impossible when she was standing by those potted palms, invisible and afraid. Run, Philippa had whispered that night. He's already chosen you. But Cecilia hadn't run. The doors had been locked, and then the storm had come, and then everything had changed. She had been trapped in a duke's house with a man who saw too much, and instead of running, she had stayed. She had stayed, and she had been seen, and she had learned that being seen was not the terrifying exposure she had always feared. Being seen by someone who loved you was safety. Being seen by someone who chose you was home. "What are you thinking about?" Sebastian asked. "The night we met, the locked doors, Philippa's warning." "Ah," his voice was rueful. "Not my finest moment. Letting you think I had trapped you there deliberately. You didn't let me think anything. Philippa locked the doors, not you. I would have, though, if I'd thought of it." He met her eyes honestly. "I would have done anything to keep you from leaving before I had a chance to convince you." "I know," she smiled. "It's one of the things I love about you. That intensity, that relentlessness, the way you pursue what you want with single-minded determination. Even when it's inappropriate. Especially when it's inappropriate." She leaned up to kiss him. "You've never been one for convention, Sebastian. Why start now?" He laughed, a sound that still had the power to surprise her. The Duke of Ravenswood, the cold collector, the man who never smiled laughing in the moonlight with his wife by the lake, where everything had almost ended so differently. "I love you," he said again, because it was true, and because he liked saying it, and because after so many years of not believing in love, he had discovered that saying the words was its own kind of joy. "I love you too," Cecilia replied. And as they walked back toward the house where their children slept, toward the life they had built against all odds, Cecilia thought about the woman she had been invisible, afraid, certain she was not enough. She thought about Philippa's warning that terrible night. "Run. He's already chosen you." She hadn't run. The doors had been locked. And behind those locked doors she had found not a trap, but a refuge, not a collector, but a man desperate to be known, not imprisonment, but the freedom of finally being seen. The doors of Ravenswood Manor stood open now, welcoming anyone who wished to enter. The locked rooms of Sebastian's heart had been unlocked one by one, opened by love and patience and the stubborn determination of a woman who refused to remain invisible. In the end, Cecilia thought, that was the real story. Not a duke who collected brides or a spinster who insulted hospitality or locked doors or ice storms. The real story was simpler and more profound. 2 people who had been hiding all their lives, finding in each other the courage to finally be seen. And they had lived, as the stories say, happily ever after.